They called it the inspection of purity. But every woman in Rome knew what it really was, a night of terror disguised as ritual. Once a year, the emperor demanded noble girls to be brought before him, barefoot, veiled, and silent, so their virtue could be examined in the name of the gods. It wasn't faith, it was control, because in Rome, fear was the law, and women's bodies were its courtroom. Who decided that holiness required humiliation? The archives whisper what the chronicles hide. If you value the record, subscribe. When the ledger closes, the bones still speak. Rome, 31 years after Christ. Beneath the marble ceilings of the imperial palace, 13 girls stand in a line, their bare feet pressed against the cold floor. The scent of incense mixes with oil and iron, sweet, then sharp. None of them speak. The silence is not sacred, it's enforced. The orders came on bronze tablets, stamped with the imperial eagle. No one dared refuse. Each house that received one knew what it meant. A daughter offered, a family measured, loyalty tested. Fathers called it an honor. Mothers did not. Valeria was 15. She had not yet married, had not yet bled. Her life had been filled with lessons in poetry, modesty, and obedience, virtues that would now be used against her. When the seal arrived, her father's hands trembled not from fear, but from pride. The emperor had called. Their family, he said, would be blessed. Her mother said nothing. She only touched her daughter's face, as if memorizing it. The night before the ritual, Valeria was bathed in warm milk and rose water. Her hair was braided with gold thread, her wrists anointed with oils that smelled of honey and myrrh. It was not preparation for worship, it was presentation, the polishing of an offering. When dawn broke, soldiers arrived in silence. They carried no weapons, but the weight of their armor spoke enough. Valeria was led to a litter draped in violet silk. The streets had been cleared for her passage. Doors were shut, windows closed. Rome watched, but only through cracks. The journey to the emperor's residence, the Dolus Augustinana, felt endless. Every turn, every echo of the litter's wheel was another heartbeat lost. Behind the palace gates, the air was still. Even the birds seemed to have learned silence. Inside waited a hall carved from marble and shadow. The girls were lined up shoulder to shoulder, their reflections flickering in polished bronze. A priestess, old and severe, walked among them, adjusting posture, measuring symmetry, correcting anything human. No laughter, no warmth, only the slow breathing of fear. In that hall, purity was not a virtue. It was proof of compliance, and the emperor, unseen behind his curtain of silk, was both judge and god. What Rome called sacred inspection was, in truth, the most efficient form of control, one that made obedience look like holiness. Before the chamber, there was the summons, and before the summons, there was belief. The kind of belief that makes people obey what they fear. When the bronze tablet arrived at the Matalis household, the servants froze mid-step. They knew what it was before reading it. The imperial seal pressed in wax, the eagle embossed above the line, by order of the emperor. The parchment inside contained only one sentence. The daughter of Marcus Metellus is to be presented for inspection. No accusation, no reason, just instruction, the kind that left no space for refusal. Her father read it 3 times, lips moving soundlessly, then smiled with a trembling dignity. "The gods favor our house," he whispered. "The emperor himself has seen us." Her mother said nothing. She turned away, her hand covering the small ivory dove she wore at her throat. It had belonged to her own mother, who had once said, "The palace always takes something from those it calls." That night, the house changed. Curtains were drawn, candles burned low, and the servants whispered prayers to Vesta as they prepared Valyria for what none dared to name. She was bathed again, not by her maids, but by attendants sent from the temple. They spoke softly, but avoided her eyes. They poured milk and rosewater over her skin until it shone pale as marble, then brushed her hair with gold dust. Every gesture was gentle, every word rehearsed. When she asked one of them what the ritual meant, the woman only said, "To be chosen is an honor," but the tremor in her voice betrayed her. At dawn, Valyria's father entered the chamber. He looked at her as one might look at a precious statue, admired, distant, proud. "Remember," he said, "you do this for Rome, for our name." She wanted to ask, for which gods? But she bit her tongue. Questions had no place in Rome's moral order. Outside, the litter awaited, draped in violet silk, guarded by 2 praetorians. Her mother followed her to the door, but did not step beyond it. Instead, she placed something in Valyria's hand, a small pendant carved into the shape of a dove. "Keep it hidden," she whispered, "and whatever they ask of you, keep one thought of your own. That is what they cannot take." The litter jolted forward. The city, usually alive with shouts and wheels, lay hushed. People turned away as the procession passed. Some crossed themselves, others knelt. No one spoke. Everyone knew where such processions ended. At the gates of the imperial residence, her escort stopped. The palace loomed above, like a mountain of marble and shadow, its columns engraved with scenes of goddesses kneeling before emperors. None depicted men bowing to women. Inside, the air shifted, heavy, perfumed, rehearsed. The sound of sandals on stone echoed endlessly down the corridor. Valyria was led through archways lined with bronze mirrors, where she saw not her face, but an image of someone being shaped for judgment. In the courtyard, 12 other girls stood waiting, draped in white veils. Some looked younger than her, others bore the stillness of those who had already given up imagining escape. A priestess approached. Her hair was grey, her robe deep crimson. Around her waist hung a ring of keys that chimed faintly with each step. She carried a scroll tied with blue silk, the same color as the ribbons later used to mark those favored by the emperor. When she spoke, her tone was calm, precise, bureaucratic. "You will not speak unless instructed. You will not look upon the emperor. You will not question the will of the gods. Your body is a vessel of Rome's virtue. Treat it as such." Each phrase fell like the clang of a lock. Valyria nodded with the others, though she did not understand half the words. What she understood was the silence afterward, the absolute stillness of girls too afraid to breathe. Hours passed. The hall darkened as torches were lit, casting red light on the marble floor. One by one, the girls were taken to be prepared. Some returned trembling. Some did not return at all. When Valeria's turn came, the attendants guided her to a smaller chamber. They painted her lips with crushed lotus and traced circles on her wrists with scented oil. Every gesture was ritualized, every word measured. One attendant whispered as she fastened the last pin on Valeria's gown, "Do not cry, tears ruin the powder." It was said with care, but it was also a warning, not to show humanity here. When the door opened, the priestess appeared again. Her voice carried the weight of ceremony. "The emperor is ready." Valeria stepped forward, her sandals soundless on the stone. The torchlight flickered, catching on the golden embroidery of her robe. She could feel her heart beating in her throat, each pulse a protest she could not voice. Behind her, the doors closed. The sound was final, like the sealing of a tomb. She realized then what her mother had meant, that this was not a test of virtue, but a measurement of obedience. And obedience, in Rome, was the highest form of faith. The priestess gestured toward the inner hall, where a curtain of silk hung across the far wall. Beyond it, unseen, waited the emperor. Valeria lowered her gaze and took her place among the others. The brazier burned in the center, the smoke rising like a warning. When the priestess raised her hand, silence deepened into something physical, not just the absence of sound, but the weight of expectation. The inspection of purity had begun. The hall was colder than night. Torchlight quivered against marble walls, carved with scenes of divine women offering gifts to emperors. None of those carved faces looked real, only obedient. Their mouths open, their eyes vacant, as if their silence had been sculpted into eternity. 13 girls stood in a single line, veils drawn, their shadows stretched long across the floor. The smell of incense mixed with oil and faint iron, the scent of something sacred that had forgotten what holiness was. The priestess moved among them with slow precision. Her robe brushed the floor like a tide. Around her waist, a belt of keys chimed faintly, each one for a door no girl had ever seen open again. Her eyes were dark, sharp, trained to see imperfections. She stopped before each girl, adjusted a shoulder, corrected a spine, lifted a chin. Each touch was brief, professional, detached, the way one inspects marble for cracks before carving. Valeria stood third from the end. Her hands were clasped, her pulse hammering so loud she was afraid others could hear it. The girl beside her was trembling, whispering something under her breath. Maybe a prayer, maybe her own name, trying not to forget it. When the priestess reached the front of the room, she raised her hand. 2 attendants stepped forward, carrying a wooden chest lined with scrolls. They opened it without ceremony. Inside lay the record of the ritual, names, families, ranks, dowries, all catalogued in careful handwriting. The empire recorded everything: births, taxes, crimes, and purity. One of the attendants unrolled a scroll and began to read. Each girl's name was replaced by her father's title: daughter of Marcus Metellus, grain commissioner of the Eastern Port, daughter of Lucius Cassius, consul of the Northern Legions. Valeria's name disappeared, replaced by the shadow of a man's reputation. Her worth now belonged to her father's standing. The ritual was never about her. It was about Rome keeping its women as reflections of men's honor. After the names were read, the priestess gave the first command. "Step forward." The youngest girl obeyed. She was barely 12. Her veil trembled as she walked into the center of the hall where the brazier burned low. The priestess circled her, nodding to attendants who took notes on wax tablets. They observed everything: posture, complexion, the steadiness of her breath. When the girl faltered, one of the attendants murmured, "Steady, child. The gods are watching." The words were meant to comfort. They sounded like a threat. Then the voice came, deep, calm, unseen, from behind the silk curtain at the far end of the chamber. "Turn her." Every head bowed. No one looked toward the voice. The priestess obeyed, guiding the girl to turn slowly, her arms at her sides. A pause, then the voice again. "Dismissed." The girl was led out through a bronze door that closed without a sound. She did not return. The next was called, then the next. Some were dismissed immediately. Others were asked to walk, to kneel, to speak a single phrase from the sacred hymns. A few broke down mid-sentence, and for each one the priestess gave a signal. 2 fingers raised slightly, and the attendants carried the girl away. No one ever explained where. When Valeria's turn came, her legs felt hollow. The priestess beckoned her toward the platform. She stepped forward, counting each breath like a thread, pulling her closer to something she could not see. The heat of the brazier brushed her face. "Lift your head." The priestess's tone was measured, but her eyes flicked toward the curtain. Valeria obeyed. She could not see him clearly, only the faint silhouette of a seated figure, motionless, waiting. The silk screen distorted his shape, but the authority in the air was unmistakable. "Walk." She moved forward, each step echoing in the vast space. "Turn." Her robe brushed the floor. She felt the weight of invisible eyes measuring her, searching not for beauty, but for submission. The priestess stopped her in place. For a long moment, there was silence. Then, from behind the curtain, "This one does not tremble." A murmur followed, male voices, low and deliberate. A laugh, brief, cut short. "Mark her." An attendant stepped forward, carrying a strip of blue silk. It was tied around Valeria's right wrist. The fabric was soft, fragrant, deceptively gentle. She did not ask what it meant. She already knew. When she was led back to her place, she saw that the others who wore blue stood apart, eyes lowered, as if the ribbon itself carried weight. The rest, those unmarked, were soon escorted away. Some tried to whisper to each other, but were silenced by a look from the priestess. Hours passed. The brazier burned lower. By midnight, only 10 girls remained. 3 had vanished through the bronze door. Their sandals were gone too, taken from beside the brazier. The priestess did not speak of them. Neither did the attendants. The ritual continued, as if absence itself were part of the design. Valeria's legs ached. She had been told not to sit. The marble beneath her knees felt like ice. Somewhere in the distance, a bell rang. Once, faint and hollow. The priestess bowed her head. "He is watching." The torches dimmed as if obeying that voice. The air thickened with smoke. Every girl bowed. None dared breathe too loud. The unseen emperor remained behind his curtain, omnipresent, yet unreachable. That was the point. His invisibility made him divine. His silence made him whole. When the final name was read, the priestess closed the scroll and pressed her seal into the wax. The ritual was complete. The girls were led into adjoining chambers, some to rest, some to be purified further. Valeria was not told which she would be. She sat alone in the half-darkness, her wrists still bound with blue silk. The air reeked of ash and perfume. Somewhere nearby, a door opened, followed by a muffled cry and the closing of iron bolts. She clutched the pendant her mother had given her, hidden beneath her robe, and pressed it against her palm until it hurt. No prayers came, only thought. A single, quieted realization. Rome did not need to destroy women to control them. It only needed them to believe that obedience was divine. Outside, the first light of dawn slipped through the high windows. It fell across the marble floor, touching the abandoned veils, the empty sandals, the faint traces of blue silk that marked those chosen for something no one would name aloud. The priests would later record the event as inspection of purity, successful. The emperor's scribes would file it under ceremonial observances, female division, and Rome would go on believing it had preserved virtue, when what it truly preserved was fear. Before the incense faded, the scribes were already writing. Every name, every gesture, every mark tied around a wrist was entered into record, not as rumor, but as evidence of order. Rome did not see ritual as superstition, it saw it as governance. The inspection of purity was not the emperor's whim. It was legalized under the moral reforms that reshaped Rome after the Republic fell, the Lex Julia de Adulterius and the Lex Papia Poppaea. These were laws written to guard chastity and population, but they were also the empire's blueprint for control. A woman's virtue became measurable. Her body, her lineage, even her silence could be taxed or rewarded. Adultery ceased to be a private sin. It became a public crime. And purity, once a matter of faith, was rewritten as a civic duty. The archives show that inspections like these were framed as ritual confirmations of lineage. The emperor's scribes claimed that the ceremony protected the moral integrity of noble families. Yet the procedures were so invasive that even Roman jurists recorded unease. One noted that virtue, when examined too closely, becomes servitude. But the law did not flinch. It never does. By the 1st century, Augustus and his successors had fused faith, family, and state into one continuous mechanism. The laws of the gods became the laws of the empire. The emperor, as Pontifex Maximus, stood both above and inside the law, priest and ruler in the same breath. His word could sanctify a festival or condemn a household. To disobey his summons was not only rebellion, it was impiety. Refusing the inspection was treated as sacrilege. A father who resisted the imperial decree could lose his citizenship. A daughter could be labeled morally deficient and barred from marriage. Fear was written into statute. And once fear became a clause in the law, it no longer needed force to function. In the Dolus Augustinana, the priestess who led the ritual was not a mystic. She was a bureaucrat. Every movement, every phrase she uttered had a corresponding line in a manual kept in the Temple of Concord. The ritual was meant to appear divine, but it was designed to be replicable, accountable, bureaucratic. This was Rome's genius: to make domination look like procedure. Even the smallest details carried legal significance. The color of the ribbons, blue, white, or gold, signified degrees of imperial favor. Blue denoted potential service. White meant unfit for divine instruction. Gold was reserved for special distinction, though the record never explained what that distinction entailed. Behind the marble silence, clerks were filing reports. Scrolls from the tabularium record payments made to temple attendants and ritual inspectors. Families of the selected girls often received tax reductions or property grants. Some were given minor political appointments, rewards labeled as donativa puritatis, the gifts of purity. Rome did not waste cruelty. It monetized it. Outside the palace, rumors spread in coded whispers. Women would speak of the blue silk as if it were a disease. Servants passed stories of daughters returning pale and voiceless, of mothers who burned incense every night afterward, not to the gods, but to whatever was left of their children's souls. Yet, none of it appeared in official chronicles. Historians of the age, men appointed by the court, wrote of the emperor's moral vigilance. They described the ceremony as a renewal of divine favor. Their accounts read like sermons, clean, structured, sterile. But the marble fragments uncovered centuries later tell a different story. Inscriptions found beneath the ruins of the Augustinana mention votive offerings of silence. Archaeologists found tokens, small ivory doves, pieces of veils, and tiny lead tablets etched with phrases like, "Let me forget," or "He sees all." These were not dedications of gratitude. They were prayers of fear. The empire had turned obedience into theology. Valeria did not yet know the words of law that bound her, but she felt their weight. The blue silk around her wrist was not just fabric. It was a signature, a living seal of compliance. When the priestess approached her again, hours after the inspection, she carried a scroll. "Daughter of Marcus Metellus," she said, "you will remain in waiting." The phrase was formulaic, bureaucratic, impossible to question. But Valeria understood its meaning. She had been selected for further service. She was not taken away that night. Instead, she was confined to a small chamber adjoining the hall. A bowl of water, a crust of bread, and a burning lamp were placed beside her. The door closed with the sound of a lock that didn't echo, the kind meant to silence, not secure. Through the thin walls, she could hear distant footsteps, faint chanting, the opening and closing of doors. Somewhere, a girl screamed once, short and muffled. Then silence again. Valeria pressed her fingers against the ribbon until the skin beneath it burned. It was smooth and beautiful, like everything else Rome called virtue. She began to understand that this ritual was not madness, nor lust, nor chaos. It was logic, the logic of empire, where control had to appear sacred, and pain had to be disguised as order. The next morning, the priestess returned. Her voice was steady, bureaucratic as ever. "The inspection is complete. Those chosen will remain. The rest will be released to their families." She looked at Valeria, then at the ribbon. "You will be remembered, daughter of Marcus Metellus." Remembered. A word that sounded like blessing, but meant surveillance. When Valeria was finally led back into the main hall, she saw that the brazier had gone out. The air smelled of ashes and rose oil. Only 10 pairs of sandals remained on the marble floor. 3 had been removed, their owners vanished. A new scroll was being sealed by the attendants. She glimpsed its title before it was rolled up. Decretum de Puritate, record of the emperor's inspection, year 31. The same law that promised virtue now had a ledger of human offerings to prove it. And in the empire that called itself the light of civilization, no one questioned how holiness had come to mean humiliation. In Rome's hierarchy, purity was no longer a quality of the soul. It was paperwork. The inspection of purity was not just a ritual. It was an institution, one that moved money, property, and power in quiet circles. Behind every prayer was a payment. Behind every sacrifice stood a ledger. Rome perfected the art of turning morality into revenue. When the empire declared virtue a public matter, it did not only legislate conduct, it monetized it. The chastity of noble women became a form of currency, proof of a family's loyalty, a gateway to land, and most of all, a way to buy proximity to the emperor himself. Families competed for summonses. To be inspected was to be noticed. To be noticed meant to be owed. A father whose daughter was selected for the ritual might receive tax exemptions, trading permits, or, in certain cases, direct payments from the imperial treasury labeled offerings of gratitude. The amounts were modest in writing, but enormous in meaning. Rome's moral code was a pyramid, and purity sat at its profitable peak. Records from the treasury of Saturn mention stipends for temple women and ritual attendants assigned to the imperial household. They were paid from the same fund that financed public games and grain distributions. Purity and spectacle drew from the same purse, because both served the same purpose: to sustain belief in Rome's divine order. Even the fabrics used during the inspection, silk imported from Syria, oils from Alexandria, perfumes from Cyprus, were supplied by merchants who won contracts through the Senate. Trade routes expanded to meet ritual demand. Religion, economy, and empire merged until it was impossible to tell where faith ended and finance began. The priests blessed, the accountants counted, and the emperor, unseen behind his curtain, presided over both. For those inside the system, complicity became survival. The priestess who tied the ribbons received regular payments recorded as custodial stipends, and the scribes who catalogued the girls' names earned bonuses for accuracy. Even silence was compensated. Families of attendants were granted food rations and protection from taxation. Rome didn't force people to participate. It rewarded them for pretending not to see. In this hierarchy of virtue, women were both symbols and collateral. A family's reputation could rise or collapse based on rumors of purity. Marriages were arranged to offset moral risk. Dowries were calculated not in coin, but in perceived chastity. The system fed on shame. Private fear transmuted into public stability. And the more fragile that stability became, the more zealously Rome enforced its morality. After the ritual, Valeria's father received a letter sealed in red wax. The emperor's office commended his family's service to the state and granted a minor tax remission on their grain exports. The decree mentioned honor bestowed upon the house of Metellus through the virtue of its daughter. No word of what had occurred within the marble hall, no word of what Valeria had seen or lost, just a transaction, clean, dignified, irreproachable. He read the letter aloud at dinner, his voice swelling with pride. "We have been blessed," he said. "Rome remembers those who serve her well." The servants cheered softly. Her mother lowered her eyes. Later that night, when the house fell silent, Valeria overheard her parents arguing in whispers. Her mother's voice broke once. "You sold her." Her father's reply was cold. "I secured her future." But in Rome, the future of a woman was never hers to secure. It belonged to the men who paid for it, wrote about it, or ruled over it. Elsewhere, the economy of virtue grew. Merchants began crafting amulets said to protect the inspected. Artisans sold miniature statues of Juno with veiled faces, symbols of piety that also signified compliance. Every object sold was a reminder that fear, when sustained long enough, becomes tradition. The poet Juvenal would later mock Rome's obsession with moral purity, writing that we worship chastity in public and purchase its illusion in private. His satire was punished, censored, and eventually erased. But fragments survive, warning that morality, once weaponized, always demands victims to sustain itself. The inspection of purity did not die with one emperor. It adapted, passed from palace to temple, from law to household custom. When the imperial edicts faded, the ideology remained, that a woman's worth was the proof of a man's discipline, and that virtue could be administered like tax. This continuity was not an accident, it was design. A ritual so economically efficient could not vanish. It only needed to change language. Later emperors would rename it the selection of vestals or the renewal of lineage. But the purpose stayed the same. The empire disguised its fear of chaos beneath a doctrine of order, binding half its population to the illusion of moral necessity. Back in her chamber, Valeria began to understand how vast that illusion was. The ribbon on her wrist had loosened slightly, but the mark beneath it stayed, a faint blue line pressed into her skin. It was not visible from afar, yet every time she moved her hand, she felt it, like a silent reminder of ownership. She was no longer being watched by soldiers or priestesses. She was being watched by the law, the invisible empire that lived inside her body. She could not sleep. Each time her eyes closed, she saw the priestess, writing in her ledger, sealing the wax with careful precision, turning her life into a line in an archive. The act was not cruel, it was indifferent. And that indifference was the most terrifying part. Because in cruelty, there is still passion. In bureaucracy, there is none. By morning, Rome awoke as if nothing had happened. The streets filled with merchants, children, and senators. The city of law continued its rhythm, its temples gleaming, its forums alive. No one spoke of the girls in the marble hall, nor of the letters sent to their fathers. The empire's moral purity had been renewed, efficiently, profitably, and without scandal. To Rome, that was success. But beneath that success was a deeper economy, one that traded not in gold, but in silence. The silence of women who could not tell their stories. The silence of families who learned to call fear honor. The silence of a civilization that mistook control for virtue. And for every girl who left the chamber alive, that silence became her inheritance. The chamber had emptied, but its silence remained. Every surface, floor, wall, and column had been polished until reflection itself seemed to bow. The space was not built for comfort. It was built for choreography. Rome understood something few civilizations dared to. Control works best when it feels like participation. And nowhere was that lesson more visible than in the inspection. Each gesture, each pause, each breath of those chosen women was part of a performance rehearsed for generations. Kneeling was not submission, it was theater. Silence was not absence, it was ritualized consent. The girls were not participants, yet the ritual could not exist without their stillness. That was how Rome engineered obedience, by making the act of endurance look like devotion. The priestess, as director of this ritual theater, moved with mechanical grace. Her commands never rose above a whisper, but every whisper carried the authority of empire. Stand, turn, lower your gaze. The words struck like instruments, setting the rhythm of movement and breath. The attendants mirrored her tone. Their faces were blank, not from cruelty, but from discipline. They had learned that emotion disrupted precision, and precision was sacred. In the empire of law, efficiency was worship. Even the instruments of the ritual were arranged like props. The brazier at the center, torches at each corner, veils folded by color, and the scroll of names laid upon an altar. Each element was measured and recorded. To deviate from order would be to defy divinity itself. Valeria, seated in a smaller chamber adjoining the main hall, watched through the thin curtain as the priestess corrected the posture of another girl. "Straighten your shoulders," she said softly. "A crooked spine displeases the gods." The words might have sounded absurd in another world, but here they carried the weight of truth. When a state repeats a lie long enough, it no longer needs believers, it only needs survivors. From the upper balcony, a scribe recorded every movement. The sound of his stylus on wax was steady, methodical. Each name, each correction, each dismissal was entered into the logbook titled Index of Virtue. The emperor would never read it himself, but the act of documentation gave the ritual its authority. Rome trusted records more than people. If a scroll existed, the truth could be forgotten. The inspection was not about the girls. It was about the audience. The empire itself was watching. The senators who whispered of discipline, the priests who promised moral reform, the citizens who craved the illusion of divine order. When law is theater, every subject becomes a spectator to their own subjugation. By dusk, the ritual entered its final stage, the oath of stillness. The girls were instructed to kneel in a circle, hands resting on their thighs, eyes fixed on the floor. The priestess moved among them, carrying a bowl of oil and a torch. She anointed each forehead with a drop of flame-tempered liquid, reciting, "Purity requires endurance. Endurance proves devotion. Devotion water ensures peace." It was a creed built to echo inside the mind long after the pain faded. Valeria flinched as the oil touched her skin. It was hotter than she expected, almost scalding. The priestess' fingers lingered for a moment, pressing lightly against her temple. "Be still," she murmured. "Stillness is grace." And Valeria obeyed. She had learned that resistance drew attention, and attention was peril. As the ritual continued, she began to notice how perfectly synchronized the movements were. The turn of heads, the folding of veils, the sound of cloth brushing marble. It was as if the empire itself breathed through them, shaping their rhythm, controlling their silence. This, she thought, was how an empire prays to itself. Beyond the silk curtain, the emperor watched. His face remained hidden, his voice silent. But the air in the room changed when he stood. Every torch flame seemed to shiver. His presence alone was the performance's climax, the moment when fear and faith became indistinguishable. No decree was needed, no command spoken. The silence of power was enough. The priestess bowed deeply, and the attendants followed. The girls remained still, their bodies caught between exhaustion and awe. The emperor lingered for a moment longer, then disappeared behind the inner curtain. The ritual, they said, had been accepted. Accepted meant complete. Complete meant unquestionable. The brazier was extinguished, one torch at a time, until the hall glowed only with the faint red of smouldering embers. The priestess turned to the girls. "You have been seen," she said simply. "Rome is pleased." Those 4 words ended the ceremony. No blessing followed, no hymn of praise, only dismissal. When the doors opened again, night had settled over the city. The girls were led out into the courtyard, where the sky stretched black and starless above the marble columns. Servants brought wine, though few drank. The priestess moved through them once more, cutting the ribbons from those deemed unselected. The blue silk was collected in a bronze bowl to be burned before dawn. Valeria watched the flames consume the ribbons, soft fabric curling into ash, and wondered if Rome believed it was purifying itself. One by one, the girls were escorted back to their litters. The streets remained empty, cleared by decree. The citizens of Rome would wake tomorrow to find their empire morally renewed, their emperor sanctified once more. No one would mention the chamber, or the heat of the oil, or the eyes behind the curtain. That was the perfection of Rome's system. It made obedience invisible. As her litter moved through the silent streets, Valeria felt neither relief nor fear, only clarity. The inspection was not madness, it was method. Every law, every ritual, every silence worked together to make power seem inevitable. In Rome, virtue had become performance, and performance was the empire's most enduring weapon. Because what people enact often enough, they begin to believe, and what they believe, they stop questioning. The empire no longer needed to command its citizens to obey. It had taught them to call obedience sacred. No one ever saw his face clearly. That was the secret of his divinity, the power of distance. Behind the silk curtain, the emperor was a shadow made holy by silence. The torchlight caught only fragments. A ring, a laurel, the faint reflection of eyes that never needed to blink. He spoke little, and when he did, his voice seemed to emerge from everywhere at once. Not from a man, but from a god, hidden inside marble and law. To see him directly was forbidden. To imagine him incorrectly was dangerous. This was how Rome built faith, by replacing presence with absence, flesh with myth. And it worked. Those who returned from the inspection often claimed they hadn't seen him at all. Yet, when they spoke, their words carried his shape, the rhythm of authority, the echo of awe. Fear had made him omnipresent. Valeria could still feel that gaze even after she left the chamber. She didn't remember his words, only the stillness that followed them, that sense of being measured by something colder than judgment. she began to understand that in Rome, the emperor didn't need to touch power. He needed only to be believed. In the archives of the Pontifex Maximus, there were instructions for imperial appearances. The emperor's physical exposure to the public was carefully timed, choreographed like ritual itself. Every glimpse was political. His steps during processions, his pauses on balconies, the lowering of his head before the Senate. The inspection of purity followed the same logic. It was designed not for the girls, but for the emperor's self-creation, to stage him as both judge and deity, the moral spine of Rome. To rule an empire of laws, he had to appear above law. To maintain fear, he had to appear beyond reach. Power, in its most perfected form, is invisible. At night, when the ritual ended and the courtyards emptied, the emperor would move through private corridors that even his guards could not enter. His chroniclers recorded nothing of these hours, yet their absence in the record is itself an answer. Those closest to him, physicians, augurs, chamber servants, were sworn to silence under the lex sacra. The penalty for violating it was not execution, but erasure. Their names removed from all family registers, their property confiscated, their graves left unmarked. Rome punished memory as harshly as it punished sin. That was how the emperor kept control, not through spectacle, but through the fear of being forgotten. Valeria's father received another letter 2 weeks after the ritual. It bore no seal, only the words, "The emperor has remembered you." Within days, 2 officials arrived to measure his land for reassignment. He was granted a new estate near the coast, fertile, profitable, and, as he boasted to his friends, proof that Rome rewards loyalty. He did not know that the same letter had been sent to a dozen other families, all fathers of daughters who had stood in that chamber. The empire distributed favor the way it distributed fear, evenly, efficiently, impersonally. To Rome, gratitude was a form of surveillance. In his private apartments, the emperor kept a collection of scrolls known as Libri Castitatis, the books of purity. They contained the records of each inspection, names, dates, and remarks in the margins written in different hands. Composed, fearful, still, promising. Each comment reduced a life to a behavioral note, a fragment of obedience preserved as evidence of empire. The scrolls were not hidden. They were catalogued and stored beside tax ledgers, military lists, and edicts. In Rome's logic, there was no difference between a census of land and a census of bodies. Both were assets. Both were property of the state. The emperor didn't need to re-watch the ritual to remember it. The empire itself remembered for him. For Valeria, memory worked differently. In the weeks after her return, she found herself awake at night, replaying the ritual in silence, not as trauma, but as revelation. She realized how much of Rome's strength depended on performance, the illusion of holiness hiding a machinery of surveillance. Every law, every statue, every temple had one purpose: to make people feel seen by something they could never see back. The emperor's gaze was not one man's sight. It was the collective eye of Rome, multiplied through marble, myth, and bureaucracy. It lived in coins that bore his image, in oaths sworn by his genius, in the way every citizen lowered their eyes when his name was spoken aloud. It lived inside her too, as a constant awareness that even her thoughts were not entirely her own. That was the genius of the Emperor's system. He made obedience instinctive. People censored themselves long before he needed to command them. One evening, as she walked through the family garden, Valeria's mother joined her. They did not speak for a while. The air smelled of laurel and rain. Her mother finally said, "You understand now, don't you, why I said not to speak too loudly? Why every word in Rome is weighed?" Valeria nodded. She did not need to explain what she understood, that silence had become their inheritance. Her mother touched the spot on Valeria's wrist where the ribbon had been tied. "It fades," she said softly, "but the Empire will always find new colors." The Emperor ruled for another 12 years. His name changed from lips to inscriptions, his policies from laws to customs. The inspection was never abolished. It simply vanished from the record, absorbed into other rites, its violence diffused into respectability. But its logic survived. Every Roman woman, noble or servant, learned the same choreography. Lower your gaze, measure your tone, let the Empire see obedience in your stillness. The Emperor's eye never closed. It merely changed form, from torchlight to law, from gaze to memory. Because Rome's greatest invention was not conquest. It was self-surveillance disguised as faith. And centuries later, when the marble halls crumbled and the names of emperors faded, the rituals still echoed. In every system that calls fear virtue, in every silence mistaken for peace. When Valeria woke, the sun had not yet reached the marble windows. The chamber still smelled of ashes and rose oil, faint traces of the night before. Her wrists ached. The ribbon was still there, blue silk, soft, weightless, but she could feel its grip in her blood. It wasn't a mark of honor. It was a label, a code that divided her from those who had already been released. She remembered the priestess's words, calm as stone. "You will remain in waiting." Waiting for what? No one had said. The attendants offered no explanations. They only spoke in phrases rehearsed to exhaustion. The Emperor remembers. Patience is piety. Silence is service. When food was brought to her cell, a slice of bread, a bowl of figs, she could not eat. Every sound outside the door made her muscles tense. At times, she heard footsteps, whispers, the distant scrape of bronze hinges. Once, the faint cry of a girl cut short. Rome had a language that needed no words. When the priestess entered again, Valeria rose instinctively. The woman carried a wax tablet, its surface etched with names and small markings. She touched the ribbon on Valeria's wrist as if confirming inventory, then pressed her stylus into the wax and made a line beside her name. "Still obedient," she murmured. "The gods favor constancy." Valeria didn't respond. She understood now that speech itself could be seen as defiance. The Empire wanted her breathing, not thinking. Every ritual, every command, every glance was designed to train her body to obey faster than her mind could object. Outside the chamber, a servant passed carrying a tray of folded silks. Valeria noticed the colors: white, gold, and the same blue as her own ribbon. She realized she was not alone in being marked, that the Empire had an entire system of color-coded devotion. White meant dismissed, gold meant exalted, and blue meant suspended, awaiting either further service or quiet disposal. It was a hierarchy that didn't need explanation. The fear it produced was enough. When evening came, the priestess led her and 2 other girls to a small courtyard. The air was sharp with incense. A fountain trickled in the center, its water tinted with saffron. They were told to wash their hands in it, to cleanse the touch of mortals. Valeria looked at her reflection rippling in the water. Her face seemed older than it had been 2 days ago, not from age, but from understanding. She had seen the inside of holiness, and it was hollow. Afterward, a scribe approached, recording each girl's name, age, and family origin. He did not look at them as people, only as entries. When he finished writing, he asked the priestess, "Disposition?" The reply came without hesitation, "Pending service." The stylus scratched again. The words meant nothing to them, but they would decide everything that happened next. As the sky darkened, Valeria was returned to her cell. A lamp burned beside the door, casting a small circle of light. She sat on the cold floor, tracing the line where the ribbon pressed into her skin. She wanted to remove it, to see what freedom might feel like, but she feared what would follow. In Rome, defiance was not punished by death, it was punished by erasure. Somewhere beyond the wall, a priest chanted a prayer. The words were familiar, verses from the hymns of Vesta that spoke of purity and flame. But to Valeria, they sounded like a dirge. Every syllable felt like a stone closing over something human. That night, she dreamed of the inspection hall, the torches, the brazier, the unseen eyes behind the curtain. In her dream, the ribbon around her wrist turned from blue to black, and when she tried to pull it off, it bled. She woke with a start, her hand clenched around the ivory dove her mother had given her. The pendant had left a small indentation in her palm, the only mark she had chosen to keep. Days passed without measure. She no longer knew if it was morning or night. The only rhythm was the priestess's footsteps and the quiet scratch of the stylus recording their behavior. Still compliant. No tears. Sleeps rarely. Every human reaction catalogued like trade inventory. Rome called it order. It was the bookkeeping of submission. On the 7th day, the door opened, and she was told to stand. The priestess entered once more, her eyes unreadable. "Your waiting has ended," she said. "You are to be returned." Valeria didn't move at first. She couldn't believe the words. "Returned?" The priestess nodded. "You have been seen. The emperor is satisfied." Satisfied. A word that meant nothing and everything. The attendants cut the ribbon from her wrist. The silk slipped to the floor soundlessly. It left behind a faint bruise, a thin blue circle that would fade, though she knew the feeling beneath it never would. The priestess handed her a white veil and instructed her to cover her head. "You are to walk as one who has served. Speak to no one. Look at no man." The gates of the palace opened before dawn. A litter waited, guarded by 2 soldiers who never met her eyes. She climbed in, clutching the pendant hidden under her veil. The streets were still empty, washed by the early light. No one saw her return, and that was the point. The empire preferred its rituals unseen, its witnesses unspoken. When she reached home, her father met her with open arms, smiling as if nothing had changed. "The emperor remembers us," he said proudly. He has rewarded our devotion." Her mother stood behind him, her hands trembling, her eyes fixed on the bruise around Valeria's wrist. That night, her father celebrated with wine and laughter, calling neighbors to toast the family's honor. Valeria sat in silence, the sound of their joy clashing against the hollow in her chest. Every cheer felt like the echo of the priestess's voice, still obedient. Later, when the house slept, she slipped into the courtyard. The air was cold and clean, smelling of rain and stone. She untied the veil and stared at the bruise under the moonlight. It looked almost like ink. She rubbed it once, but it didn't fade. She finally understood what the blue silk truly meant. It was not a blessing, not even a curse. It was a reminder, a quiet symbol of how easily the empire could brand its will upon the body and call it virtue. And though the ribbon was gone, she carried its pressure in every heartbeat, in every silence she could not break. The empire no longer needed to hold her. It had already written itself beneath her skin. When dawn broke over the city, the empire had already moved on. The streets filled with merchants, the forums with gossip, and the Senate with speeches praising the emperor's renewal of Roman virtue. Nothing in their words hinted that 13 girls had spent the night kneeling on marble, that fear had been mistaken for holiness. Rome always began the day as if its nights had no memory. Valeria's return was noted in no record. No decree acknowledged her presence, no clerical hand wrote her name. But her father's new title appeared in the imperial register that same week, advisor to the Eastern Grain Council. His fortune had been elevated, his family restored to favor. The price was invisible, and that made it sacred. At dinner, he spoke as though the gods themselves had smiled upon him. "The emperor rewards loyalty," he declared. "Our house has been purified by his notice." He didn't see how Valeria flinched at the word purified. Her mother said nothing, only poured more wine than usual. When the servants left, she whispered, "Did he touch you?" Valeria shook her head slowly. "No," she said. "He didn't have to." For the first time, her mother met her eyes and did not look away. That silence between them became an understanding, an inheritance that would be passed quietly from mother to daughter long after laws and emperors were gone. But Rome never left its chosen untouched. Even when it released them, it expected gratitude. Valeria's father ordered a small shrine built near the atrium, a marble relief of Juno, goddess of chastity, with a laurel wreath carved above her head. Visitors praised its beauty. No one asked what it meant to build a monument to a virtue that had demanded their daughter's body as proof. Each morning, the new servants lit incense at the shrine, and her father would stand before it with pride, offering prayers for the family's fortune. Valeria could barely pass it without feeling the air tighten in her chest. The smoke smelled of cedar and oil, the same scent that had filled the chamber of purity. She had learned to breathe shallowly, so the memory would not return too quickly. Weeks turned to months. Her father's name began appearing on invitations to senatorial banquets, his voice among those who praised the emperor's divine reforms. He told the story often, how their family had been chosen, how their daughter had served. He said it as if reciting a myth already carved in stone. Each time he spoke, the neighbors nodded with envy. "To be seen by the emperor himself," they said, "is an honor few are given." Valeria smiled when expected, bowed when told, and spoke only when directly addressed. In Rome, silence was survival disguised as grace. At night, she sometimes heard her mother praying, not aloud, but in small gasps, a rhythm between breath and grief. She never spoke the emperor's name. Some nights she lit a candle beside the small ivory dove Valeria had returned with, the one thing the palace had not taken. When Valeria asked why she kept it there, her mother said, "To remind myself that something once belonged to us." The blue mark on her wrist faded, but the habit it left behind did not. She had learned to move carefully, to measure every word before it left her lips. The empire's touch had taught her precision, when to bow her head, when to look away, when to appear unbroken. Her silence was no longer fear, it was armor. In time, she began to hear whispers of other families, of daughters who had gone to the palace and never returned, of mothers who kept their rooms sealed like tombs. None of it reached the public record. In the ledgers of Rome, no one disappeared. They simply ceased to be written. The empire's cruelty was not its violence, but its administration. It erased pain the way it counted taxes, efficiently, without malice. Years later, when Valeria walked through the market, she noticed a group of young girls dressed in white, their veils trimmed with blue. They were laughing, arms full of garlands, heading toward the forum for what their teacher called the renewal of the sacred vow. She watched them pass, their innocence unbroken, their laughter echoing against the stone. None of them knew that rituals could have other names. None of them knew that the empire's gentlest words always hid the sharpest edges. That night, Valeria dreamed again of the chamber. But this time, she was not a girl kneeling on cold marble. She was standing among the pillars, watching others walk forward, hearing the priestess repeat the same phrases she once obeyed. When she woke, she realized the horror was not that the ritual had happened, but that it could happen again, and no one would ever call it by its true name. Her father died a few years later, his honors intact, his wealth secured. At his funeral, senators praised his devotion and his faith in the moral order of Rome. His body was laid to rest in a tomb of polished limestone, inscribed with the words, "Servant of virtue, loyal to empire." Valeria stood beside her mother and wondered how many lives those words had cost. When the mourners left, she traced the carving with her fingers. The stone was smooth, the letters perfect. The empire's craftsmanship was always flawless. That was how it hid its guilt. That night, Valeria burned the white veil she had been given. The silk shriveled quickly, leaving no trace. Watching the ash drift upward, she whispered the words the priestess once used, "Still obedient." But this time, she said them as mockery, not prayer. She knew the empire would never record her defiance. It recorded only what confirmed its order. But in that private act, she understood something her father never could, that Rome's real fragility was its dependence on silence. It needed people to believe that obedience was natural, that virtue required suffering, that power was eternal. The chamber of purity was gone. The priests were gone. The emperor's name would one day fade from marble. But as Valeria looked at her wrist, at the faint memory of blue beneath her skin, she realized the empire's mark had become her memory, and memory could be sharper than law. It would not be written in any archive, but it would live in every woman who learned to stay silent, not out of fear, but to listen and to remember. Rome remembered loyalty the way it remembered victory, by rewarding the survivors and burying the cost. After her father's death, the Metellus estate passed to her husband, a senator's son chosen for her by imperial decree. The marriage had been arranged years before, a convenient union of two houses blessed by shared virtue. To the public, Valeria was an image of Roman perfection, composed, chaste, a wife who honored the gods and her lineage. People bowed when she entered the forum. Children whispered her name in lessons about moral conduct. But in the quiet of her own home, she knew she had become a monument, not to faith, but to endurance. Each morning she performed the rituals expected of her, offerings to Juno for fertility, libations to Vesta for domestic order. Every movement was slow, measured, almost mechanical. Her husband praised her restraint, her silence, her grace. He never noticed that every word he spoke about her was the same word once written on the wax tablets of the chamber. Compliant, still, untroubled. He loved the symbol of her. The woman herself was irrelevant. Rome rewarded her obedience with peace, a peace that demanded she never speak of what bought it. In exchange for silence, she was allowed safety, status, a place in the empire's moral architecture. That was the empire's final genius, to make silence a privilege. At festivals, senators' wives would speak to her about the virtue of our daughters, repeating phrases carved into public monuments. Valeria smiled where required, answering in words so polished they no longer felt her own. They spoke of faith, she spoke of discipline. They spoke of purity, she spoke of control. None of them noticed the difference. Her mother, now grey and fragile, visited often. They rarely discussed the past, but sometimes, after wine dulled the weight of caution, her mother would whisper, "Do you ever dream of that place?" Valeria would nod. Yes, but the faces are gone. Only the sound of the keys remains. Her mother sighed. That is how Rome works. It takes the names and leaves the sounds. Years passed like that, quiet, ordered, polished. The empire shifted, emperors rose and fell, but the rituals of purity remained. The chamber had been renamed the Hall of Renewal under a Wata ruler. The inspection continued under new titles and softer language. Now the chosen girls were honored maidens, and the priests were custodians of moral instruction. Nothing changed but the vocabulary. Rome's cruelty had learned diplomacy. Valeria had 2 children, both daughters. The first, Aurelia, carried her father's ambition, clever, outspoken, too curious for the world she'd been born into. The second, Livia, was quiet, observant, often sitting in the garden listening more than speaking. Valeria loved them both fiercely, though she had never been taught how to show it. She had grown up in a world where love was restraint. When Aurelia turned 12, a messenger arrived from the palace. The wax seal was gold. Valeria recognized the weight of it before she even touched it. The words were painfully familiar. By order of the emperor, the daughters of noble houses are to be presented for instruction in divine virtue. Her husband read it aloud with pride. "An honor," he said, "just as your father once received." Valeria said nothing. Her mother's warning echoed in her mind. The Empire always finds new colors. That night, she sat beside her daughter's bed. Aurelia was still awake, eyes wide, both excited and frightened. "Mother," she asked softly, "what happens in the palace?" Valeria hesitated. The air seemed to tighten between them. She wanted to tell the truth, that holiness in Rome had teeth, that the palace devoured girls and returned them as statues. But the truth would destroy her daughter's peace, and Rome had taught her that survival sometimes meant silence. So she said only, "It is not a place for fear, but for remembering who you are. Whatever they ask, you must remember that." Aurelia smiled, reassured. "Then I will be brave." Valeria kissed her forehead and whispered, "Yes, my brave one." Then she left the room and wept quietly in the corridor, her hand pressed to the spot on her wrist where the ribbon had once been. In the morning, she went to the shrine her father had built and touched the carved face of Juno. The stone was cold. For the first time, she prayed, not to the goddess, not even to the emperor, but to memory itself. "Let her return," she said. "Let her return still herself." Days later, the litter came to take Aurelia away. The streets were cleared, the neighbors bowed, the priests blessed the procession. It was a mirror of Valeria's own past. The same violet silk, the same guards in silver armor, the same silence disguised as reverence. When the gates closed behind her daughter, Valeria's world went still. She turned to her mother, who stood beside her, hands trembling. "Do you see?" Valeria whispered. "The Empire never ends. It just changes its victims." Her mother nodded. "Then we must remember them. That's how it dies." That night, Valeria refused to sleep. She sat by the window until dawn, eyes fixed on the eastern horizon. The city outside looked so perfect in the morning light, clean, symmetrical, eternal. But beneath its marble, she knew there were bones. Women like her, whose obedience had built that symmetry. The Empire called them pure, she called them forgotten. Rome believed its reward for virtue was immortality, but Valeria understood the truth. Immortality in Rome was not life without end. It was pain without witness. She closed her eyes and made a promise that no law could erase. She would not let silence be her daughter's inheritance. Weeks passed before Aurelia returned. When she did, the litter stopped at the gate in silence, the guards motionless, their faces carved from stone. Valeria waited in the courtyard, her heart beating so hard she could hear it in her ears. She saw her daughter step down, alive, whole, but quieter. Something in her eyes had changed. No one said what had happened in the palace. No one ever did. The priests who accompanied her bowed deeply to Valeria's husband and recited the usual blessing. "The Emperor's favor rests upon this house. Your daughter has been found pleasing in discipline and composure." Valeria's husband beamed with pride. "The gods are merciful," he said. Her mother, standing behind her, whispered only one word: "Again." Aurelia was taken inside to rest. Her veil was folded neatly over her arm. Beneath it, Valeria caught a glimpse of her wrist. There was no ribbon, but the skin was faintly discolored, a shadow of something that had once been bound. She said nothing. Aurelia said nothing, but they both knew. That evening, when the guests left, Valeria found her daughter sitting alone by the window, staring at the city lights. "Are you hurt?" she asked softly. Aurelia shook her head. "No, I'm fine. They were kind." Valeria recognized the tone, the same voice she had once used to calm her own mother, a tone too calm to be true. "Did you speak to him?" "No," Aurelia said. "We don't see him. We only kneel." Valeria nodded. She wanted to cry, but her tears had long been trained not to fall. She sat beside her daughter, took her hand, and pressed her palm against the faint mark. "If you remember nothing else," she whispered, "remember that none of this is divine. It's only men pretending to be gods." Aurelia didn't answer. She leaned her head on her mother's shoulder, and for the first time in years, Valeria allowed herself to hold someone without fear. The next morning, the household celebrated again. Letters of favor arrived from the Senate. Priests visited to bless the family. The emperor had remembered them once more. But to Valeria, each word of praise felt like a nail driven deeper into the coffin of truth. The empire had survived through centuries by mastering one thing: inheritance. Not of blood, but of fear. Every generation of women was taught the same lessons: walk softly, speak little, serve quietly. The empire no longer needed soldiers to enforce obedience. It had turned mothers into guardians of its order. Valeria saw it everywhere, in the way women lowered their eyes in public, in how quickly they silenced their daughters when they asked too many questions. Rome had turned survival into worship. The inspection hall had become invisible, absorbed into daily life. At temple festivals, the priestesses still spoke of purity, of the goddess Vesta watching over the city's virtue. But Valeria knew now that Vesta's flame was no divine gift. It was a monument to endurance, a fire that burned because women were forced to feed it. Her mother died quietly that winter, her last words a plea whispered against Valeria's ear. Don't let them make her forget. Years passed. Aurelia married young, a senator's son like her mother before her. Livia, the younger daughter, remained at home. She was gentler, her voice soft, but her eyes sharp with curiosity. One evening she asked, "Mother, why does everyone say the emperor is like a god? Didn't the gods die long ago?" Valeria smiled faintly. In Rome, gods never die. They change their names and their faces. That's how they survive. Livia looked puzzled. And what happens when people stop believing? Then the gods begin to fear. Valeria didn't realize she had spoken the truth aloud until her daughter nodded and said, "Then maybe that's how empires end." That night, Valeria could not sleep. She walked through this garden under the cold light of the moon, remembering the voices that had once ruled her world, the priestess, the attendants, the whispers of law pretending to be faith. For years, she had tried to forget them, but now she felt something different. Pity. Pity for a world so terrified of its own weakness that it had to disguise control as virtue. Pity for an empire that feared women's silence, but feared their voices even more. In her later years, when her daughters were grown, and the empire began to fracture, Valeria noticed cracks in the marble of Rome's perfection. Statues fell during earthquakes. temples emptied during plagues. Priests spoke louder, promising purification through sacrifice, but fewer people listened. Even the emperor's image on coins began to wear away, his face fading from circulation as if memory itself had turned against him. And yet, in small corners of the city, women began to gather. Not in defiance, Rome would have crushed that, but in quiet remembrance. They shared stories, not prayers. They spoke of the chamber as rumor, as legend, as something that might have happened long ago. But each woman who spoke carried the same mark, invisible yet undeniable. The knowledge of how power had once entered their lives without asking. Valeria joined them once. She never said her name. She didn't need to. When one of the younger women asked, "Was it real?" she only replied, "It was Rome." There was silence after that. But it was not the silence of fear. It was the silence of recognition, of something awakening. When Valeria died, her daughters found among her belongings a small box carved from olive wood. Inside lay the ivory dove, worn smooth from decades of being held. Beneath it was a strip of fabric, brittle with age. Blue, faded almost to white. Neither daughter knew what it meant, but both kept it. Years later, when the empire itself finally broke apart, when marble turned to ruin and the old gods' names fell from memory, that small piece of silk survived. It was found centuries later by an archaeologist digging near the Palatine Hill. He described it in his notes as a fragment of dyed cloth, likely ceremonial, significance unknown. But the truth was still there, hidden in the fibers, the echo of a ritual, the weight of an empire's lie, the mark of women who learned that survival was not silence, but remembrance. Rome had built its power on the illusion that obedience could erase pain. But memory, carried quietly through generations, became the one thing it could never control. And long after the stones of the palace turned to dust, the memory remained. Centuries later, the marble cracked and the names faded. The palace that once glowed with torchlight became a hill of dust and weeds. Tourists would one day walk across its ruins, reading placards that spoke of triumphs, laws, and emperors, but not of the girls who had been brought here barefoot and silent. The empire that called itself eternal had forgotten the weight of its own rituals. Yet, the earth remembered. Beneath layers of ash and stone, archaeologists found fragments, bits of ivory carved into doves, scorched traces of silk, and tiny lead tablets engraved with words so faint they needed magnification to be read. One of them said simply, "He sees all." Another, "Still obedient." The official report described them as votive offerings. But the spacing of the words, the tremor in their carving, suggested something else. Messages, not prayers. Testimonies left by women who could not speak freely, buried in the foundations of empire like seeds waiting for light. That was Rome's true monument, not the Colosseum, not the Forum, not the laws chiseled into stone, but the quiet record kept in bone and dust. Because the bones always remember. Historians would argue later whether the inspection of purity ever truly existed. Some call it myth. Others a distortion of the Vestal rites, a moral fable invented by early Christian chroniclers. But fragments persist in the archives. Letters, receipts, a line from an imperial ledger that lists 13 garments prepared for ceremonial presentation. Even the absences speak. The missing names in family records, the gaps in census counts, the strange annotations in temple accounts where money was allocated for female instruction and ritual renewal. The evidence is scattered, incomplete, but undeniable in its pattern. Civilization, after all, is meticulous when it comes to remembering its greatness and careless with the truth of its victims. Rome claimed to have built a world ruled by law, but those laws were written in flesh. And when the flesh turned to dust, the empire's perfection turned hollow. Centuries passed. Kings replaced emperors, priests replaced magistrates. But the logic of control survived. In monasteries and courts, in households and classrooms, the same ritual repeated in gentler words. Women still knelt. Men still called it virtue. And the language of holiness continued to disguise the machinery of obedience. But memory has its own empire. In every age that followed, the story resurfaced, half myth, half warning. A chronicler in the 9th century mentioned maidens presented for the emperor's gaze. A poet in the Renaissance wrote of blue ribbons worn by those who endured unseen. A modern scholar dismissed it as superstition, but her voice trembled when she said it. Every retelling was an act of resistance. Every disbelief was a confession of fear, because what people refuse to believe is often what they already know to be true. If you stand today among the ruins of the Palatine Hill, the air still carries a weight, as if the stones remember the posture of those who knelt there. The wind passes through broken columns like breath through ribs. It hums faintly, the way silence does when it has too many names buried beneath it. Archaeologists have catalogued every artifact, photographed every mark, dated every piece of pottery. But what cannot be recorded is what was felt here, the tremor that passes through history when the powerless are made to believe that obedience is divine. Each century adds another layer of forgetting. Yet forgetting is never total. It leaves outlines, like shadows burned into walls. Somewhere, in the museum's storage rooms, that faded ribbon of blue still lies under glass, mislabeled, unremarkable. To those who know, it is enough. It is proof that the empire's silence was not perfect. The empire fell, but its logic did not. It still lives in every place where law disguises fear, where faith demands endurance, where virtue is measured by submission. In the end, Valeria's story is not about Rome. It is about power, and how power learns to speak the language of sanctity. Every empire invents its own rituals to make pain look sacred. Every ruler learns that devotion is cheaper than justice. Rome perfected it. The world inherited it. But the record, once written, never dies. Beneath the ruins, in the archives, in the quiet hands of those who remember, the bones still whisper their truth. That purity, once demanded by force, always leaves corruption behind. That silence, once enforced, becomes testimony. The chronicles may fall quiet, the statues may crumble, the priests may rewrite the prayers, but history has a pulse, and in the dark, it beats. If you listen closely, you can still hear them, the girls of Rome, their breath echoing through the stones, their voices low and steady, asking the question that haunted an empire: who decided that holiness required humiliation? And then, softly, The answer: no one ever did. They only obeyed. If you value the record, subscribe. When the ledger closes, the bones still speak.